Hello everybody and welcome to chapter number 8, Aggregate Expenditures. And in this chapter we're going to be dealing with a graphical representation of gross domestic product. So a little bit of an extension of chapter number 5. And in terms of this chapter, really no sense in terms of beating around the bush. This is probably the worst chapter that we're going to have to deal with for the entire semester. If you thought the previous chapters were pretty bad, well then this one's going to be downright atrocious. And chapter number 8 is pretty bad because it deals with a lot of abstract, abstruse, and complex materials, and it's kind of difficult for you to apply a few of these things into your own everyday lives. And we have to get through chapter number 8 because it ties directly into chapter number 9, and the stuff in chapter number 9 is going to be seen in every single chapter for the rest of the semester. So we still have to get through this chapter no matter what because it builds up our foundation of supply and demand that we're going to see in the next chapter. So what can you guys do in order to make this chapter a little bit more feasible for you guys, just to make it a little bit more simplistic? Well, number one, it's exactly what you guys are doing. You're watching this video and understanding the material. Trying to do this by yourself is downright just terrible. You want to have someone guide you along the way. You do want to go ahead, take a look at the material, get a good grasp and foundation of it, just starting us off, and you're getting a good start by taking a look at this video. Number two is just to take the information as given. So it's sort of natural, of course, in economics to take in a whole bunch of different variables and factors, your own everyday experiences into the models that we see in these particular chapters. But in this chapter, it's going to be very, very apparent that you want to keep things ceteris paribus. Just use the information that's being provided to you. Try not to bring in anything outside in order to make your analysis and predictions much, much more simple. And then finally here, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I am available all the vast majority of the time. So if you have any questions about the things that we lay out within this particular chapter, feel free to contact me. So let's go ahead and get started with this particular chapter. And like we said, this is just going to be an extension of chapter number 5 of gross domestic product. And we want to see if there's going to be a graphical representation of GDP in this particular section. So once again, we need to go ahead and find the components of aggregate spending, which is just GDP as we call it in chapter number 5. And we want to break down each of the components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, and see what they look like graphically within this particular chapter. And within each of these particular components, there are a few things that we need to talk about a little bit more in depth. On the consumption side, we'll talk about MPC and MPS. Under investment, we'll talk a little bit about the multiplier. And once we hit every single variable, we'll go ahead and take a look at the full macroeconomic equilibrium. So full macroeconomic equilibrium under the Keynesian sense is going to deal with every single factor, with every single variable under GDP, and we'll see what that is going to look like graphically. So there's a simple macroeconomic equilibrium and a full macroeconomic equilibrium, and we'll take a look at the differences there. And then finally, we'll end the chapter just by taking a look at recessionary and inflationary gaps, and this is going to make the full usage of the spending multiplier. So the spending multiplier, the first multiplier that we take a look at in macroeconomics. So just starting this off, we want to go ahead and talk a little bit about history first. So before 1930, so pre-1930s, mainstream economic thought that a laissez-faire approach was best for the economy. So there's really no need for economics at all. The vast majority of individuals, government officials, economists basically believed that the economy was self-correcting, and we consider this to be called the classical model of economics. And if you believe the classical train of thought, you basically say, hey, we don't need any government intervention at all. We just want to leave it alone, hands off. And they believed that the economy was self-correcting and always adjusted to full employment by the forces of supply and demand. So if there were any type of shock within the economy would adjust instantaneously or right away in order to push us back to full employment. And it doesn't matter if it was a negative shock or a positive shock. And because we see that all these macroeconomic variables that we've talked about so far, prices, wages, interest rates, they're all considered to be flexible. So something bad or good happens within the economy, all of these variables right here are going to adjust, they're going to be flexible, they're going to adjust right away, and that will always lead us to full employment. So pre-1930s, there was really no need for economics at all because the vast majority of people believed in this laissez-faire approach, the classical model of economics. However, what was the one big event that basically turned this model on its head? And because you see the time frame right here, pre-1930s, so what happened after the 1930s, this is where the Great Depression occurred. So the Great Depression basically just upended the classical train of thought. We didn't adjust to our full long run or full employment equilibrium instantaneously. There was actually a short run effect or there was going to be some type of time lag before we can actually reach our long run equilibrium, as they sort of call it. So here, all of our variables, they don't adjust instantaneously or simultaneously. There's going to be a lag period where we can actually experience the bad or the good effects of any one particular event, and then after some time we'll adjust back to our long run. So the Great Depression, this was a very bad negative shock, prolonged downturn, which pretty much challenged the classical perspective. And this is exactly where a new train of economics came up, which is known as the Keynesian model. And this was developed by John Maynard Keynes, who argued that the government actually had a very important role in stabilizing a distressed economy. So no longer did we believe that, or did these economists believe that a laissez-faire approach was best. We actually needed a lot of government intervention in order to smooth out a bit the business cycle or this recession that we have right here. Keynesians argued that prices and wages were sticky or slow to adjust. So prices, wages, interest rates, they could actually be very, very slow to change. They don't adjust instantaneously to the long run equilibrium. So here, this is why we consider, this is under the Keynesian train of thought, we believe that the variables, the vast majority of macroeconomic variables that we take a look at are considered to be sticky. So they don't adjust very, very fast. And basically, from the model that he came up with within the Great Depression, is the model that we take a look at within this particular chapter, and then there are going to be a few extensions that we add to that in chapter number 9. So here he published this entire model on the general theory of employment, interest, and money in 1936, and this was probably the very first macroeconomic sort of the beginnings of macroeconomics. So John Maynard Keynes, he's the father of macroeconomics. He's basically the reason why we have to study macroeconomics, the big jerk. But basically, the model that he built up in this book is what we're going to be taking a look at. So the model that he came up with is something known as aggregate expenditures. And aggregate expenditures is the total amount that firms, households plan to spend on goods and services at each level of income. So here we're going to actually bring in a relationship between GDP and income now. So no longer are we just taking a look at the spending components, we're actually adding in a relationship. So here, take a look at aggregate expenditures. Aggregate expenditures. So aggregate expenditures, we can denote it as AE just for short. And this is going to be the total amount that firms and households, the total amount that firms and households plan to spend on goods and services, at each level of income. So here, once again, aggregate expenditures, this is the model that Keynes came up with during the Great Depression, the total amount that firms and households plan to spend on goods and services at each level of income. So here, this sort of definition right here sounds very familiar to something that we've already seen. The amount spent on goods and services, well, that's just our idea of GDP. So aggregate expenditures is exactly very similar or very identical to GDP. And GDP, remember the components, it's going to be consumption, investment, government spending, add in exports, and then subtract out imports. So anytime we talk about aggregate expenditures, it's just our idea of gross domestic product and these 5 variables right here under the expenditure approach. Consumption, investment, government spending, exports, and imports. The one difference here is now we add in a relationship with aggregate expenditures, which is going to be what is our GDP going to be, what are our spending components going to be for every single level of income. So that's going to be the one major difference, and that is going to allow us to graphically or illustrate every single one of these components onto a Cartesian plane. So here, you have a basic idea of what aggregate expenditures is, and it's our job to break down each one of these components once again to see exactly how that's going to play with a relationship with income. So as we start us off, we remember that aggregate expenditures is just going to be the 5 components that we see right here: consumption, investment, government spending, exports, and imports. And then in the next few videos, we're going to go ahead and break down each one of these components and see a little bit more in depth what they look like graphically, as well as a few of the idiosyncratic sort of concepts that come up under each of the variables.